Good morning and welcome to the 32nd meeting in 2013 of the Health and Sport Committee. As usual, can I remind those present to switch off mobile phones, Blackberries and other wireless devices, as they can often interfere with the sound system. Members of the public may also have noticed that some members and officials are using iPads and tablet devices instead of hard copies of their papers. We have a continuing apology for Richard Simpson, and Malcolm Chisholm is with us here as the Labour Party substitute. I also give a warm welcome to Colin Kerr, who joins the committee, replacing Mark MacDonald. As our first item on the agenda, as normal, Colin, we invite you to declare any relevant interest.
Thank you for your welcome, Convener, and I have no interest to declare. Thank
you. The second item on the agenda today is our historic and indeed groundbreaking Ask the Health Secretary session, and can I give a warm welcome to the Cabinet Secretary and Geoff Huggins, who is accompanying the Cabinet Secretary this morning to participate in this session. The committee asked members of the public what questions we would ask the Cabinet Secretary using social media to promote this session, and we received 126 questions. You'll be relieved, Cabinet Secretary, we have agreed that we can't ask all of the 126. We may follow up on that. Unfortunately, clearly we don't have the time to go through that. But I'll go around the table inviting members to ask the questions and ask members to state the questioner's name, where they're from, and if relevant, the organisation and the subject area before reading out the questions. Members will have the opportunity to ask their own supplementary questions after the Cabinet Secretary's initial answer to each question. In order to hopefully get all through 18 questions, I've been choosing. I ask for brevity in the members' supplementaries, and if I can ask the Cabinet Secretary the same in your answers. I now turn to Gil Patterson to ask the first question in this historic session. Gil, the honour is yours.
Yes, thanks very much. It certainly is an honour, a new innovation, a bit like the Petitions Committee. It's new to Parliament, as I understand it. The convener said there was 126 questions. He's made it plain that we can't get to them all. I've just been given the first 50 to do. No, seriously, it is innovative, and I hope it is very successful. It's new to us, and we hope that both the public and the government and the committee get some benefit from it, Cabinet Secretary. But I've got a first question in relation to plain packaging, and it comes from Dennis Williams in Edinburgh, and it's as follows. It's actually two questions. I'll split it because it's two distinct questions, I feel. As someone whose business will be directly affected by plain packaging, can you please provide me with any concrete evidence that this policy will have any impact on youth smoking rates and tobacco consumption as a whole?
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Gil. Thank you, Convener. Can I begin by congratulating the committee on this historic innovation and say that this is absolutely the kind of thing I think from time to time the Parliament should be doing. And I'm glad to be the first Cabinet Secretary to be participating in such an event. And thank you also for prior notice of the question. In terms of the question asked by Gil on behalf of Dennis Williams, I would say that the Public Health Research Consortium undertook a systematic review of the evidence on plain standardised tobacco packaging. This review found that there is strong evidence to support the propositions that standardised packaging would reduce the attractiveness and appeal of tobacco products, increase the noticeability and effectiveness of health warnings and messages, and reduce the use of design techniques that may mislead customers about the harmfulness of tobacco products. The review also found that standardised packaging was most likely to be effective in preventing the uptake of smoking amongst young people. This is key to our efforts to reduce smoking prevalence across Scotland. Following our analysis of the consultation responses, our view is that the PHRC review provides the authoritative evidence base for the introduction of standardised packaging, and a review of a further 17 recent research studies published by Stirling University in September this year reaffirmed the main findings of the earlier review.
Thanks very much for that answer. I know that the government at one time was very, very keen in implementing this, but there seems to have been some delay in getting to where we are. Can you maybe explain to the committee why the delay took place and when we're likely to see this taking place?
Well, basically, we've been looking at all the evidence, and as I say, the most recent evidence was only completed in September this year, and very substantive evidence published by Stirling University. We are very much an evidence-led government in terms of, before we introduce any new legislation, we like to be absolutely sure that the evidence that is there, as much as it can be, that the legislation will achieve its purpose. Obviously, the most attention has also been paid to Australia, where already this measure has been introduced. And we have been in touch with the Australians. It's too early to say definitely that it's been a success in Australia, but the anecdotal evidence from Australia seems to suggest that it will be, and that it tends to be, the anecdotal evidence appears to be upholding and reaffirming the evidence from Stirling University and from the PHRC review.
Mr Williams actually asks for some kind of details, although I think he perceives it's going to have an effect on his business, but in between the lines he's saying what benefit will that impact on his business pass on to individuals. So in relation to that, what anticipated benefit do you see? What's the kind of where do you see this going in terms of both health issues? What impact will it have on people's health, particularly young people, and on budgetary constraints? Is it going to free up any money by providing less people presenting to hospital?
Well, I think generally, like that? I think generally the evidence is the fewer people who smoke and the more we can reduce the incidence of smoking, then the better the health outcomes we get. I mean, we've seen already the very rapid impact that the legislation this Parliament pioneered in terms of smoking in public places. That had a very rapid impact on the incidence of ill health, particularly, say, the childhood asthma at the time it was introduced, and that continues to be a long-term benefit to the health of the nation. So any measure at all that can either reduce the incidence of smoking or prevent the uptake of smoking in young people is going to be beneficial primarily to the health outcomes of the nation, but also more generally to the economy, because obviously ill health, particularly preventable ill health, is costly to business because it increases taxes. It's costly to individuals because it increases taxes, because we've got to fund, obviously, the effects of that ill health. People lose work when they're ill, productivity goes down, profits are affected. Every aspect of business is affected adversely when people become ill. And we do know irrefutably that when people smoke, their chances of becoming ill are substantially increased, and the chances of hospitalisation are substantially increased. Their chances of early death are substantially increased. So it's to everybody's benefit if we can reduce the incidence of smoking and prevent the uptake by younger members of our society.
Thanks for that. I'll go into the second part of Mr. Sorry.
That wasn't the second part, would
you know that wasn't the second part?
Yeah, I remind members and the Cabinet Secretary of my call for brevitying the question. Gil.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. This is the other bits of my questions. Now this is the second part of Mr. Williams' question. Also, can you convince me that the government is doing all it can to combat the illicit trade, which is directly harming my business and fueling a wholly unregulated black economy?
Along with the UK government, we are doing everything we possibly can to reduce the incidence of illicit trade. And a recent report of the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group on Smoking and Health in March this year the evidence to that showed that enforcement agencies don't rely actually on pack design to test whether packs are illicit. They use a number of other security features found in existing packaging, including coded numbers and anti-counterfeit marks, all of which would also be present on standardised packs. So in terms of this measure, it would not in any way increase the amount of illicit tobacco trade or make it easier for those who engage in it. I would also like to highlight the recent report from the National Audit Office on tackling tobacco smuggling in June 2013, and that showed good progress is being made here with a reduction in the market share for illicit tobacco products between 2001 and 2010 from 21% to 9% in cigarettes, and a reduction from 61% to 38% for hand-rolling tobacco. So we are winning the war against the illicit tobacco trade.
I had a supplementary to that, but I'll pass on that.
I've got some of the other members who want to get in the back of Richard Lyle, certainly. Is there any others? Richard.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. As you know, and I've got a confession to make, I'm a smoker. I started smoking when I was 12, and I still smoke. I totally agree with this measure, and I totally agree with the previous measures. Can you actually assure me or give me an indication, because talking to other smokers, they're supporting this measure. Can you inform me when this actual physically will be introduced, and what will be on the package? Will it just be the name of the cigarette at the top?
Yeah, there'll be other things like the coding that I've already referred to, and it's our intention to introduce the necessary legislation within the next year to 18 months.
Year to 18 months, Cabinet Secretary?
Yeah, the Cabinet is still to finalise the next set of bills to come before the Parliament. This will be included, but exactly the timing will depend on a whole range of other matters.
Okay, press on. I think I've got the next one, haven't I? Which is question 2, which is from Stephen Morrison in Glasgow. Stephen raises the age-old question of inactivity continues to blight the health of the nation. What more or different can we do to ensure more participation in activity in sport?
Can I first of all say, Convener, I totally agree with the premise of the question that we need to do much more to get people, many more people, much more active in all age groups. And I'll mention some of the things that we're doing. We're developing a new national walking strategy to build on government investment to both the core path network and specific interventions to support people walking, such as Pass for All. Secondly, a pilot study launched earlier this year in primary care will deliver accurate assessment, advice and intervention regarding physical activity and signpost people to appropriate resources, including community sports hubs. Thirdly, we're taking forward a new national physical activity implementation plan. Fourthly, we're developing a youth sports strategy to ensure we deliver the best, most appropriate opportunities for young people to participate in sport. And we're continuing to invest in a number of other initiatives to increase physical activity levels, including investing almost £3 million in physical activity projects, including the Pass for All and Active Girls, aimed at those furthest away from meeting the recommended physical activity guidelines. And that's over and above the national programmes such as the Active Schools programme, which provides almost 5 million opportunities a year for young people to be active.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. You'll be aware that the Health and Sport Committee produced their community sport report, and we focused, I think rightly, on all of those sterling volunteers who run our sports clubs and deliver sport nightly, weekly, daily in our communities, tens of thousands of them. We're very proud of that, but we note figures that volunteering in Scotland lags behind quite a bit from our European competitors. In Finland, there's a 16.5% participation in volunteers. Ireland, there's 15%. Netherlands, about 11%. I'm not going on for time. But in the UK, there are some indicators in the information we have from Sport Scotland that we're lagging behind England, Wales and Northern Ireland in our participation of volunteers. What do we need to do to encourage greater participation for those volunteers and support them?
Well, in addition to all the initiatives, we are certainly not short of initiatives. We've also announced, my colleague Shona Robson's announced a £10 million legacy programme for the Commonwealth Games, and part of that will be to address the very issue that you've rightly highlighted about increasing the participation rate amongst the volunteers, because I think we've got to get the message across that physical activity is absolutely critically important, not just in terms of for its own sake, but the three big killers in Scotland still are cancer, stroke and heart attacks, and all the evidence shows that even a half an hour's walking a day goes a long way to preventing heart attacks, strokes and even cancer. So we are doing everything we possibly can, but I agree with you, we need to do more, and the purpose of that additional £10 million in the Legacy Fund was to do more.
With £10 million, it's very close to the figure that was announced by the lottery funding in August this year. Is that the same pocket of funding? It's a re-announcement, isn't it?
Which fund did you say there?
Well, the lottery, the legacy
yes,
money. It's lottery funding that the Minister re-announced.
It's the same 10 million.
I thought so. It's just I think the committee and the Sport Inquiry is focused on the number of people we had available and their skill sets, etc. The UK coaching certificate and people at level 1, there was 3,000 people took that in 2010-11. There was 2,654 took it in 11-12. There was 2,800 took that certificate, and we're not through the year yet in 2013, but it seems to have dropped off to 554 people. Level 2, similar amounts of people. There seems to be in terms of measuring the outcomes, I know there's a lot of money going in, but it's outcomes. What are we doing seriously to test these outcomes and ensure that the money that we're putting in is building our capacity in volunteers in terms of numbers and the skills that they have?
Well, we use the kind of participation rates that you've already mentioned in your second last question, Convener, to monitor progress. And obviously, while those participation rates are low compared to other European countries, they have been rising, my understanding is, in recent years, but they're nowhere near where they need to be, which is exactly why we're undertaking all these initiatives that we are doing. The other thing I think it's fair to say, and this is not to blame anybody, but obviously there was a squeeze on local lottery funding up until the Olympics because of the concentration and the diversion of funds into the Olympics. And I think that possibly had a detrimental impact on local activity and the local funding. Now, that's worked its way out the system, and the lottery funds have been freed up again because obviously the Olympics are well and truly over. And I would hope to see, in terms of the participation rates that you've mentioned and other key measures, that we see an improvement in the physical health of the nation.
Time to pursue it, obviously, just remember, but the rates were higher in 10, 11 and 12 taking certificates, and they're dropping off now. The actual set and the audit that we did on volunteers is beyond its sell-by date, it would seem, because it was done in 2007 and 2010. And I think we're just anxious that when people, hopefully, become more interested in the Commonwealth Games, that we are capable of. I think that was a point that the committee was making, that we have got that capacity to pick up that enthusiasm, ensure people take up sport and continue with sport. Is there any other members wish to go there?
Can I just come in quickly on the walking strategy, which I welcome? SNH has published a map of some of the longer routes in Scotland, the West Highland Way and routes of that length. One of the issues is access to those walks, and indeed some of the ones you talked about with public transport. Is it possible to tie that up and make sure that information is available so that people can get out to those walks and do parts of them? They don't have to do them all. They can break them down and use public transport to get there and get away again.
It's certainly an issue I'm happy to take up with Keith Brown, the Minister of Transport, to ensure that there's a proper joined-up approach, because obviously for a lot of people the likes of the West Highland Way and long walks of that nature are very much part and parcel of the kind of thing we're encouraging people to do.
Now move to Bob Doris for a question on cardiac rehabilitation service.
Thanks, Convener. Actually, I did have a supplementary on that question,
sorry.
but I knew it was coming in next, so I just waited patiently. It's really just a request. I fleetingly was on the Infrastructure Committee as a substitute, and we were taking some evidence on cycling within Scotland. I know the Scottish Government has put significant amounts of money in partnership with local authorities, and also note Glasgow City Council actually won an award just yesterday for its progress in relation to cycling. At that other committee, one of the questions I raised was, is the money going to be spent on those who cycling more, or actually getting people who are not cycling to take a bike and get active? In other words, that kind of investment can actually lead to exacerbating unintentionally health inequalities. I wouldn't expect you to have the answer to that, Cabinet Secretary, but can I ask you to work across portfolio so that when that money's been spent, that part of it is actually used to get people who don't normally cycle and are not normally active to get on a bike and do some active travel, or else, as beneficial as it is, what we'll end up doing is exacerbating health inequalities.
And the objective really is to do both, because the more people cycle, then the better for the environment, the better for them health-wise, the less crowded the roads are, and similarly, the more people who cycle, as well as the more cyclists cycle, have these benefits as well. So the objective is to do both.
Thank you very much for that. I'll now move on to a question from Geoff Holt. And I don't know which part of the country Geoff comes from, but that might actually be quite useful, because his question is about positive experiences he's had in relation to cardiac rehabilitation services after he unfortunately suffered a heart attack. So whilst that's a positive thing, he does have a concern that such services might not be widely available to people with heart failure across the country. So a positive experience about how the NHS supported Mr Holt in terms of cardiac rehabilitation, but more information how we can make sure that quality, consistent approach is rolled out across the country.
Can I first of all say that in terms of tackling heart disease, we've had quite a lot of success. Since 1995, there's been a 60% reduction in across Scotland in premature heart deaths, coronary heart deaths. So a 6% reduction is very substantial, but we still obviously want to go further. The clinical standards we operate by govern this, so that's why I'm fairly confident that in every part of Scotland we have very good services for coronary care. And we the latest audits show substantial increases in the number of people with heart disease getting access to cardiac rehabilitation, which I think is the core of the question, and that's risen from 45% 5 years ago to 60% last year. Obviously, we'll continue to push that improvement, and the key cardiac rehabilitation stakeholders actually met yesterday to explore all of the issues around access to cardiac rehabilitation, including access in the community for people with heart failure. Future work will include revised signed guidelines for cardiac rehabilitation to be delivered next year, modernisation and new focus on supporting services to redesign to enhance both the capacity and quality of services. Lothian, Tayside, Ayrshire and Arran have already started this process. Ongoing monitoring of the provision of cardiac rehabilitation and a new focus on access to exercise support in the community ties into the previous question. We've asked the British Heart Foundation and the Chest, Heart and Stroke Scotland to develop a project which looks at how we can support an increase in the uptake of exercise classes within the community for people with long-term conditions, including heart failure. So, as I say, we've had success. It's still a long way to go, and we are introducing further measures to try to get us into an even better position in the future.
Okay, you mentioned there that access to cardiac rehabilitation services increased from 45% to 60%. Of course, this is to be welcomed. The new sign guidance that you intimated there, also, do you anticipate that when that feeds into the health boards that you would expect that 60% to go to 70%, 80%? Is there a specific target in relation to how we would take this forward?
We haven't got a specific target in terms of 70 or 80%. I mean, the objective must be eventually to try to get to 100%, because obviously that will then ensure that no matter who is affected by this, they will receive the appropriate rehabilitation. But certainly a further step change is how I would describe the way forward.
You would expect to see increase without actually having a specific benchmark for that. Can I ask you whether, I don't know if you've got the information there, if you'd have to write to the committee, but is there a geographical variation in access to, well, clearly there must be if it's 60%, because that's not all of the country, but clearly in Glasgow, the area I represent, unfortunately, staying in the north of Glasgow, I see many of my constituents, for a variety of reasons, been far more at risk of cardiac issues and cardiac arrest than others. So, for example, Greater Glasgow and Clyde, who may have the greatest burden in terms of this, how are they performing in relation to access to cardiac services?
Well, there's wide variation within Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and there's wide variation between the 14 territorial boards. Well, I'm not saying wide variation, but there is variation, and some of that, of course, is to do with the incidence of heart disease, because where you get poverty and deprivation, you get a much higher incidence of chronic heart disease. Where you get smoking, you get a much higher incidence of chronic heart disease. Where you get other bad habits, you get a much higher rate of chronic heart disease. And obviously in tailoring services, we try to tailor the services to where they're most needed. But what I will do is I'll provide a detailed breakdown for the committee, we'll circulate it to all the committee, of the 60% across the country and how that pans out between boards, and where we can, we'll provide information within Greater Glasgow and Clyde.
One final question, Convener, for the Cabinet Secretary. I think we should mention the recent research part funded by the British Heart Foundation from Edinburgh University, which looked at scanning techniques to identify the build-up of significant fatty plaques, which could predict, we hope, those most likely of cardiac arrest, and take preventative measures, whether it's identifying the need for a stent much earlier on within their patient journey, or high-dose medication to lower that risk. Now, I know that research needs to be, I think, peer-reviewed and just kind of a bit more work done upon that. But could you tell me what the Scottish Government's thoughts would be when such positive research comes out of an excellent Scottish university, what the pathway would be to feed some of that into making these services a reality for my constituents?
Well, obviously that's a very exciting development that was announced yesterday, but let's be realistic about this. It will be 5 to 10 years before the necessary work has been done to make sure that that can become part of the mainstream activity in preventing heart disease. There's still a lot of work to be done in that particular project, so I don't want to set expectations that that service is going to be available next year or the year after, because there's still a lot of work to be done before it gets to nearly that stage. But obviously, not just in terms of heart disease, but in terms of the introduction of any new techniques, there is obviously a fairly well-laid path from point of proof of concept, which obviously we basically, I think, have proof of concept in this particular project that was announced yesterday, right through to the point where it can be prescribed for patients or part of a preventive programme. And that journey and the length of that journey can vary according to the complexity of the technique. I've already mentioned that the estimate is a 5 to 10 year horizon for the project that was announced yesterday at Edinburgh University. If it can be speeded up, obviously we would be keen to speed it up, but I don't want to set expectations that are unrealistic. Depending on the complexity of a technique, that journey could be 2 or 3 years from proof of concept to general prescribing, or it could be 10 years. It just depends. I mean, we read day and daily of new ways of tackling all kinds of diseases, particularly cancer and heart disease and dementia, for example. But very often, from the time they appear in the Daily Express until they're available to patients, it can be a long number of years.
I suppose really just a comment, Queen. I don't have another question, but the important thing is what you're saying, Cabinet Secretary, is that when these new developments emerge, the Scottish Government will work in partnership with the research institutions to see how they can be brought to mainstream provision within the NHS. And if it's 10 years, it's 10 years, but the important thing is the planning for that starts now. The office, our Chief Scientist's office actually funds some of this research.
because clearly we want to speed these processes along as much as we possibly can. For example, one of the areas in which the Chief Scientist is spending a lot of time and giving priority to is the whole area of data collection and data mining, because we now know that Scotland, first of all, it should be said, has a huge advantage in terms of the amount of data we collect on patients, and that allows us to take the initiative in a number of these areas. Let me take, for example, diabetes, which is actually the area of expertise for Dr Andrew Morris, the Chief Scientific Advisor in Health to the Scottish Government. Using data and informatics and the science of informatics, over the last few years, we've been able to reduce the number of amputations for diabetics by 40% in Scotland, and we've reduced the incidence of blindness resulting from diabetes by over 80%. So some of these initiatives, we don't just work with the companies, some of these projects are initiated by the Scottish Government. So we have a very, very close working relationship with all these companies and indeed with the universities.
Thank you very much.
Is there any other supplementary questions on that? Just other, I suppose we're dealing with the budget. Is it the Chief Scientific Officer got more money to spend on research this year or less?
Well, actually, if you look at the budget, in fact, you asked the question, I think the R&D line the R&D line is slightly down, but what we're doing, two things. Number one is we're leveraging funding in, particularly from European programmes. That means the overall spend that we're involved in is greater. And secondly, we are there's a lot of R&D that goes on that's not actually in the R&D line.
I think you answered my question. Less. We now move to Colin Kerr.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. This is a question from Robin Lattimore, MBE of Bankery, who says Grampian Health Board has relied in the past for funding from various external sources, including the Lottery, BHF Scotland and the Change Fund for its heart failure nursing service. Can the Cabinet Secretary address my concerns that the Board is likely to discontinue the service, especially given that heart disease is a national clinical priority?
Can I first of all just emphasise the importance of the heart failure nurses in supporting the care of people with acute heart failure? And can I also say that we want to ensure services, NHS boards have the full spectrum of heart failure services in place to meet service demands posed by the increasing incidence of heart failure. Ultimately, of course, it's for the boards to ensure that services, including heart failure nurse provision, meet the needs of their local population. NHS Grampian has advised that options to better support the local heart failure nurse service were recently considered as part of a resource allocation process. I understand that a business case for continuing and developing its heart failure nursing service has been through NHS Grampian's decision-making and scrutiny process, and a recommendation for approval has been made, which is good news. So as part of wider proposals, I'm advised that the existing 3.24 whole-time equivalent specialist heart failure nursing post will continue to be funded on a recurring basis by NHS Grampian, and indeed this will be increased to 5.25 whole-time equivalent heart fail nurses. So that's obviously good news for Mr Latimer.
Thank you for that. If we just follow on a national level, he says for individual boards, and how does this service work throughout the country? Is it patchy or is it very similar to that of Grampian?
No, I wouldn't say it's patchy, but obviously depending on the scale of the problem, because obviously there is a variation in terms of the incidence of heart disease. As I said earlier, there is a very high correlation between the incidence of heart disease and the level of poverty and deprivation. Now, in the Grampian area, particularly in the urban part of Grampian, we don't have, compared to, say, Glasgow, high levels of poverty and deprivation. So heart failure resulting from that tends to be much lower. But obviously against that, we have also a different profile of population, but nevertheless requiring improvement in heart failure services, and that's why Grampian are investing in that. So the territorial boards look at the profile and demography of their own area, and the whole point of delegating this decision-making and resource allocation to them is that they allocate resources depending on the priorities in their area. And obviously, you know, if you're referring to Grampian, basically you've got Aberdeen City, and then you've got a huge rural hinterland. And sometimes it's the scale of that huge rural hinterland that means you might need to employ more of a particular kind of resource, such as these heart failure nurses, simply because of travelling distances involved, for example, and the pattern of the geography as well as the demography in an area. In Glasgow, which is a much more concentrated urban population, you may be able to provide the same level of service, but with fewer people, because you don't have the huge complexity of having a rural hinterland on the scale that Grampian has.
Any supplementaries on that session? No. We move then to Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Convener. Elaine Holmes from Newton Mearns asks why it's not mandatory for clinicians to report adverse incidents involving transvaginal mesh implants to the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Authority. And on the same issue, Anne Bonney from Edinburgh would like to know why a national register has not been implemented because of the numerous complications due to the use of transvaginal mesh.
Convener, I'm going to give a reasonably detailed answer on this because it has been the subject. As you know, I've had quite a number of meetings with representatives of the patients on this, so I wanted to just put in the record some of the facts that you know, are important in this. Can I first of all say at present there is no mandatory system of reporting of adverse incidents for any implants, including transvaginal mesh, within the UK. Adverse incidents concerning medical devices reported through the NHS in Scotland are handled by the Incident Reporting Investigation Centre at Health Facilities Scotland, which itself is part of NHS National Services Scotland. As the investigating authority for adverse incidents in Scotland, Health Facilities Scotland uses similar but not identical report assessment and triage processes to the MHRA, resulting in a range of outcomes from no action to specialist investigation. HFS will also coordinate any investigation. It liaises closely with the MHRA, notifying it of each adverse incident reported in Scotland and the results of any investigation. HFS is also responsible for passing on reports to each NHS board's equipment coordinator or risk manager. This system is voluntary, although clinicians are encouraged to report incidents as set out in good medical practice guidance for doctors from the General Medical Council. Agreement has been reached that the current voluntary register, supported by the two UK national professional bodies for urogynecologists and urological surgeons, will be merged into a single national register. Scotland will work with the clinical community to support reporting of all adverse events and clinical outcomes through this new register when it is set up.
Okay. And the national register, will that be used as a national register as well? So everything will be on the register,
yes,
including those who haven't had adverse incidents?
Well, the register is of adverse incidents, but obviously we are keeping a close and we are investigating very closely just the number of adverse incidents that have been. Can I say one of the issues here is a lot of these procedures have been taking place in the private sector as opposed to under the National Health Service. So obviously that gives a dimension to this in terms of tracking it. And regulation is reserved matter. Now that's not an excuse, but that's why we need to work very closely with MHRA. And the regulations are decided by the MHRA, not by the Scottish Government.
What steps are you taking to make sure that other people aren't fitted with the mesh and face similar complications? Are they being advised of the concerns that have been raised? Well, are they being fully informed before they have treatment?
Yeah. The Chief Medical Officer has written to all health boards and to a range of other people and GPs indicating that, you know, the scale and the nature of this problem that has arisen, and also to ensure that if any woman comes forward for this procedure or is referred for this procedure, that they are made absolutely, totally aware of the risks involved.
Malcolm, I should ask first of all, I suppose, is there any supplementaries, and then bring Malcolm in? No? Malcolm.
Well, mine's are separate questions, but they're on the same subject. The first one is from Kathleen Parish, and she's asking a question. Well, I don't think this is within your power to do this. Presumably it's the MHRA that might have the power, but she's asking, as a result of the harmful effects of these mesh devices, when can they be expected to be removed from the market, avoiding further damage? So presumably that's an issue for the MHRA, but perhaps I could also ask what discussions you've had with the MHRA about this.
We've been in ongoing discussion over a number of months now, and we've already set up a working group to address the issues raised by women affecting complications from mesh surgery, and this will include a care pathway for surgeries for complications. But we're also, in terms of the exact preciseness of your question, Malcolm, we are encouraging the MHRA to take a very robust approach to this whole area, because very clearly there is a lot of disquiet, there's been a lot of very unsuccessful procedures which have had long-term impacts on the women affected. So we're working also with the women to consult them at every stage of what we're doing and trying to fulfil their request in terms of the National Register was one request, for example, but also to ensure a more robust approach to inspection, to regulation, to dissemination of information and so on, because clearly this has been caused a lot of heartache, to say the least.
I think you may have answered, at least in part, my second question, which is from Fiona Moat in Wishaw. She wants to know how the Scottish Government plans to support mesh victims. So if you could give a bit more detail on what you've said already, and I suppose also perhaps give a bit more detail in terms of what you mean by a robust approach. It does rather suggest that you're being critical of the MHRA up till now, which I'm not objecting to, but I wonder what a more robust approach might involve in some detail.
Well, I think the regulation, particularly of the private sector of these procedures, needs to be toughened up, and clearly not just the procedures but the devices and the sale of the devices themselves. In terms of women who have been adversely affected by these procedures, we have made it clear that if rectification is required, then, and there is a clinical need for that, then that can be and will be appropriately supplied by the National Health Service, and the Chief Medical Officer has made that clear to all the health boards that that's what should happen.
Okay. Any supplementaries on that one? No. Aileen McLeod.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I have a number of questions I'd like to ask around the very important issue of support for people with rare diseases and conditions. And my question comes from Patricia Osborne from Dundee on behalf of the Brittle Bone Society. And as you're probably aware, Cabinet Secretary, that society is the only charity within the UK that supports people with a genetic bone condition called osteogenesis imperfecta, which is, as I say, genetic bone condition that's characterised by fragile bones that break easily. And her first question is, how will the Scottish Government monitor improvement in the care of children and adults that are living with rare diseases and conditions in Scotland every day over the next 10 years?
Can I first of all say there is an estimated total of over 6,000 rare diseases that have been identified. Certainly where at least one person has or has had these diseases in the UK at some time. So we're talking about a very large number of rare diseases. And I think, to be fair, it is probably only in recent years that the need to do something more for people with rare diseases has come on to the horizon and nearer the top of the health agenda, which is quite right that it should. Because while we obviously focus in on the diseases that affect many thousands of people like heart, stroke and cancer, if you're affected by one of these rare diseases, you can suffer just as badly or sometimes worse than some of the people with the more common ailments. Very much this is a UK approach, because we see advantage in working together with our colleagues in London and Cardiff and Belfast, and together we've set up a UK rare disease, we're developing a UK rare disease strategy aimed at improving services and support for people living with rare diseases. The UK-wide work delivers on the European Union Council recommendation of 4 years ago to Member States to take action on rare diseases by the end of this year. And that specifically asks that Member States should establish and implement plans or strategies for rare diseases at the appropriate level, or explore measures for rare diseases and other public health strategies in order to aim to ensure that patients with rare diseases have access to high-quality care, including diagnostics, treatments, habilitation for those living with the disease, and if possible effective orphan drugs. And you may remember we've set up a rare disease drugs fund in Scotland, and for example the 51 children in Scotland with the Celtic gene makeup with cystic fibrosis have benefited by getting access to the Kyla-Daco drug, which is estimated will extend their lives by up to 16.5 years. And that's a very practical example of what we're doing. The UK strategy is actually due to be published this month on rare diseases, and each of the 4 countries is also developing an implementation plan aimed for publication on Friday, the 28th of February next year, which is World Rare Disease Day. And obviously incorporated in that will be issues associated with brittle bone disease, for example.
Thank you very much for that response, Cabinet Secretary, and also to draw our attention to when the UK Rare Disease Strategy is going to be published. That was actually going to be one of my follow-up questions to you. But within that strategy, I mean, obviously one of the other issues that Patricia Osborne has raised is around the extent to which there will be adequate transitional services, and how much improvement there can be made to current access to complex wheelchairs, and whether there'd be any opportunity or not, whether that to require to be reviewed through the current quality framework.
Yep. As you probably know, 4 years ago, the Wheelchair and Seating Services Modernisation Action Plan was launched in Scotland, and it contained 53 actions relating to service improvement and formed the basis of our Wheelchair and Seating Services Modernisation project. The Wheelchair and Seating Services Delivery Group assessed the position in relation to all the actions set out in the action plan, and an additional £16 million was invested in wheelchair services to achieve improvements in areas including referral pathways, preventative maintenance, planned clinical reviews and improved access to powered wheelchairs. Local NHS boards and wheelchair service centres determined how this funding was targeted to achieve maximum improvement. The Wheelchair and Seating Services Quality Improvement Framework was issued in spring 2012 with the expectation they would oversee continuing improvement based on the agreed set of standards. To support continuous improvement in wheelchair services beyond the life of the modernisation project, an additional £1.7 million recurring expenditure was invested via annual allocations to NHS boards. There are no current plans to review the quality framework, and it's a matter for NHS boards to assess the needs of the resident population and provide appropriate services, but clearly they're operating to a much higher level of quality than what had been the case prior to 2009.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And just finally, my last question was around what measures are being taken to use patients' input of their own experiences to assist in the training, practices and supervision across the full spectrum of NHS healthcare professionals in relation to multidisciplinary care for those who have rare and long-term conditions.
Well, that's primarily through the Person-Centred Care Collaborative, and that's the whole point of that, not just in relation to this particular question, but through other ways in which we want to ensure patient involvement, is to ensure that the patients and the end users are actually involved in looking at how we take things forward. And I would hope that the person who submitted the question from Dundee, I think it was, is involved in the Tayside group.
Thanks, Ian. Any supplementaries arising from that? Thank you. We now move to Nanette Millen, and this is a section here of, for mental health services and issues. And Nanette hasn't asked a question, so I'll allow you to do that, and then I'll take, I think, Richard and Colin Kerr together for the Cabinet Secretary just to push on.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, Cabinet Secretary. This question is from Fiona Sinclair from Ayrshire on behalf of Autism Rights, and she asks, do you think that people with learning disabilities or autism should be included in the provisions of the Mental Health Act, even when they don't have a mental illness? Do you agree that this is discriminatory? And do you support the Millen Committee and McManus's report's call to review the situation?
I say this is quite, as you're probably aware, a long-standing debate going way back to the Bruce Millen's review of mental health services in Scotland, and I think it was Malcolm who commissioned that review, which was an excellent review. I think the first thing to say is that many people in the autistic spectrum also do have additional learning disabilities such as dyslexia, behavioural conditions such as attention deficit disorder and or mental illnesses, most commonly depression or anxiety, and in some cases psychosis. So if, for example, a learning disability is taken out of the Mental Health Act, then a similar yet parallel system of protection would need to be set up under separate legislation. This would add another layer of complexity to the current mental health and adults with incapacity legislation and the adult support and protection statutory framework. And we don't think that would be helpful. We don't believe that it is discriminatory for autism to be included in the 2003 Act. Indeed, I would argue that in terms of the provision of services, it is actually beneficial. There's a difference between coming within the scope of the mental health legislation and the secondary step of meeting the criteria for compulsory measures of care and treatment under the 2003 Act, and I think we should continue to make that very clear distinction. However, we will keep the need for separate legislation under review, although we've got no current plans to do so. I should more generally, in terms of mental health, also mention that Scotland is doing very well in terms of our spend in mental health. If you look at the global average percentage of money spent on mental health as a percentage of the health budget, it averages 3%. We are 3 to 4 times that, and not just in Scotland as a whole, but I think in almost every health board area we're spending at least 3 times the global average as a percentage of the total health spend. So we're doing very well in mental health, and obviously that includes resources for dealing with autism.
Thank you. As you said, this issue goes back quite a long way, and I mean, I think the initial report was in 2001, followed by the 2003 legislation, and at that time there was a recommendation for an early review of the situation. I think Fiona Sinclair will be disappointed to hear that you don't have current plans for that review, and I just wonder, can you put any possible timescale on when a review might take place?
We're not setting our face against the review. What we're saying is, at the moment, we have no plans to change the status. We will look, and we are looking at, the case for a review, and it's not something I've set my face against, but I would need to see justification for it, because clearly to change the status would have fairly radical implications for the delivery of services and for the cost of the delivery of services, and that may not be to the advantage of either people with autism or indeed others who suffer from mental health problems. But, we're not saying no to a review, but at the present time we're not saying yes either.
Thank you. Thank you for the answers. I suspect you might some rights in the near future.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm happy to meet with anyone or ask Michael Matheson, who takes the lead on this matter for the Scottish Government, to meet with people, because we are a listening government. So if people feel strongly about this issue, and if they can persuade us, then we approach these matters with an open and fair mind.
We have an additional couple of questions on this. One from Richard Lyle and Colin Keir.
I actually have a question from Autism Rights, so you're getting it earlier what you thought, Cabinet Secretary. Do you agree that these issues need to be aired in public and that the Scottish Government should have published the responses to the consultation on the mental health strategy on its website?
Well, we did make it publicly available in the Scottish Government Library. I'm happy to make sure it goes on the website. I don't see why we shouldn't put it on the website. I didn't realise until this question came in that it wasn't on the website. So it's not a big issue to put it on the website. It's already in the Scottish Government Library.
Autism and the other conditions that you mentioned earlier are more and more coming to the fore. Would you agree or disagree that autism and the other conditions are on a rise in the last 20 years, or is it a case that we just are recognising the situations in regards to what's happened to children?
Well, actually, in terms of the latest statistics, there's a bit of a plateau in terms of the number of people being diagnosed with autism. I think what has happened is that, first of all, in terms of children, parents are much more aware of the possibility of autism, teachers are much more aware of the possibility of autism, and GPs are much more aware than they were 20 or 30 years ago. And I think that's been the case, and therefore the rate of diagnosis did increase substantially. As I say, it started to plateau a bit, but the other factor I think is absolutely key in this is that there are, I think, more and more adults with autism only now being diagnosed with autism in recent years. And I suspect that there's still quite a number of people with autism who are of an adult age who don't realise they have autism, or their family and friends don't realise they have autism. And therefore, and certainly in terms of my caseload as a constituency MSP, I've certainly been dealing with a number of adults who find it difficult to get the services and support they require because their autism has only been diagnosed in adulthood as opposed to being diagnosed in childhood. And I still think we have a lot to do, not just in terms of young people with autism, but in terms of adults with autism, and to provide the necessary level and quality of support and services that they need.
I know that you have a very open door policy, and I've had experience of people who have contacted me, and you've instantly been able to see them, diary pressures convening. Would you give an undertaking, as I think you did, that you would be quite happy to meet with autism?
Myself and Michael Matheson, depending on diary, but you know, to get an earlier meeting, probably better to make it initially Michael. But you know, Michael and I are absolutely open, and I have to say, Michael Matheson has been doing a sterling piece of work on autism, because he's very, and indeed, my own local group, my own constituency, Hope for Autism, Michael met them recently and had a very successful meeting just about improving the quality of services being delivered to them, and they cover basically the North Lanarkshire area. And as I say, both of us have an open door policy because we want to hear firsthand where services are not being delivered to the quality, standard or quantity that's required.
Thank you.
Thank you, this is a question from Margaret McCool of South Lanarkshire. You may have partially answered it earlier on, but in the foreseeable future, will there be more of the health budget put towards mental health issues and more publicity as to where help can be obtained?
Yeah, I mean, as I already said, we're actually spending 3 to 4 times the average global spend of the total health budget on mental health. It used to be, I remember many, many years ago, mental health was the Cinderella service of the National Health Service. And one thing, and I think to be fair to my predecessors, including Malcolm, I think we've all shared the agenda of making sure that mental health was given the resources it needs. Because clearly mental health problems, and that includes a wide range of different conditions, needs the same level of support to meet the need as does any other form of health problem. Now, in terms of rising budgets, what we believe, and I'm going to bring Geoff in here because this is his area of expertise, but he does a regular round of all the territorial health boards in relation to mental health services on a regular basis. And the evidence that he is collecting is that service improvement is taking place across the whole of Scotland, and sometimes the service reconfiguration is leading to a better way of doing things, leading to better mental health outcomes, but also simultaneously, because we're not putting people through so many hoops, saving money, but that money that's being saved is not just being reinvested into frontline services, it's being reinvested into frontline mental health services. And I'm going to ask Geoff to give you some more detail on that.
Yeah, just yesterday I was in Ayrshire and Arran for our autumn visit. We visit twice a year, and partly in the context of some of the media reporting, one of the questions which we've decided to ask this time is, are you seeing reductions in mental health spend? And these meetings are clinicians, managers, and the objective is really to find out what's going on. What we're finding, certainly yesterday in Ayrshire and Arran, certainly last week as well in Tayside, is that people are continuing to do work on efficiency. So they're continuing to try and ensure that services are working effectively. And a lot of that's often about taking sort of additional loops that patients have to go round, which they don't really welcome out of the system. But we're also, and this has maybe surprised me a wee bit, finding that boards are identifying additional spend in particular areas. So yesterday we heard that Ayrshire and Arran have had to have created additional dementia advisor posts to support the post-diagnostic dementia commitment. They're also increasing their CAMS capability to ensure they meet the 18-week target. And they've also done some work with the police around the work that's going on around custody suites. Similarly last week in the discussion with Tayside, talking about the access to psychological therapies target, where Tayside's a really good performer generally, but it's got two of its smaller services where it's perhaps a bit weaker. They're identifying new spend going into health psychology, but also into neuropsychology as well, the areas where its performance at the moment isn't achieving 18 weeks, so just to ensure that it does. So in each of these cases, we're hearing of another £100,000 here, another £200,000 there, and at the same time, we're not seeing significant cuts in NHS services elsewhere to meet those. Those are coming out of other general allocations. So it's been really quite a heartening round of visits. This at a time when we might have expected to hear more about belt tightening and things like that.
Could I?
Yes, certainly.
Yeah. Just one of the things you were mentioning there, it takes me back, since this is my first health committee, come from Justice. And I would. One of the things that was coming up is in terms of the people with mental health issues within the justice system, in terms of particularly those on short-term visits to prison, and how we're actually dealing with this, and the way that the finances, if you like, are being allocated towards looking after of some of these people who perhaps shouldn't be in prison, but perhaps would be better dealt with outside.
Can I say, from recent experience of this at a constituency level, and I do think there is an issue around the transition from when prisoners are discharged, irrespective of how long they've served the sentence, in terms of the continuation of psychiatric care. And it's an area I think we need to look at to tighten up on, to make sure that when a prisoner leaves prison and is already under psychiatric supervision, even I'm not referring to any kind of secure type supervision, just mental health supervision, that we should ensure that there is a continuum and that the transition is better managed between prison and the community. I think there's a general issue there, and it's one that we will address.
Any other supplementary on that? No. I have a question from Kevin Toshney in Dundee, asking what the Cabinet Secretary's views are on the 15-minute care calls for older people.
Sorry,
the question
the 15-minute care calls.
Kevin Toshney in Dundee, asking the Cabinet Secretary of his views on the 15-minute care calls for older people.
Can I say 15-minute sessions can be the building blocks for an agreed package of care, and in some cases it may be what the client wants. Clearly, for more complex cases, a 15-minute visit would not be sufficient time to provide appropriate support. Packages should be designed and delivered to reflect the client's needs and promote their rights. By integrating health and social care, pooling resources and introducing a strategic commissioning approach, we are enabling partnerships to take a more holistic view based on the outcomes to be achieved, both for individuals and partnerships. We currently do not routinely collect information which would allow us to understand the extent to which this type of service has a positive impact on the personal outcomes for service users. We have therefore asked the Association of Directors of Social Work to consider this issue further. And if evidence shows that longer visits provide better outcomes, then we must work together to ensure what guidance might be needed. There's also a review of national review of care standards, and I would expect this issue to feature in terms of the evidence to that national review and suggestions for any improvement.
Do you think they're acceptable, the 15-minute, or indeed the evidence that we had that earlier, where a 10-minute visit to provide someone with prepare and provide someone with their lunch. You know, is that acceptable?
It's not acceptable if the purpose of the visit requires substantially more time than that.
You've mentioned national care standards, which was identified in the committee's inquiry, which we look forward to. I suppose there is a bit of delay in that, and we had a commitment that that was coming along. The question of whether procurement or commissioning can play a part in addressing this issue.
I think inevitably, Convener, it must do, and obviously that's something that the Association of Directors of Social Work will be looking into. I had a meeting with the directors 2 weeks ago, and this particular issue of the 15-minute care and the allegations surrounding it is one of the key areas that they are going to be looking at as part of the work they are undertaking, and I think they'll be able to put some facts, hopefully, around the situation, because certainly there's a lot of anecdotal evidence for and against, and I think we need to get to the bottom of it, and the purpose of their reviews to do exactly that.
Yeah, I think that's particularly interesting, because it can become, you know, it's a 10-minute visit when we know that not all visits are 10 minutes or 15, some are longer. Has there been any work in terms of, have you required any information from local authorities and the providers here to establish what extent the 10-minute or the 15-minute visit is being used, or indeed the other issue of continuity of care, where there's increasing numbers of different carers going in over a week or a month or whatever? Have you commissioned any work there to establish the extent of the problem?
At the moment, that information is not collected centrally, but obviously one of the issues which the Association of Directors of Social Work in their review will be looking at as to whether we need to monitor that on a much closer basis and collect that information centrally.
Expect that review to be published?
It'll be fairly early in 2014.
Okay, thanks. Any other supplementaries on that? Richard.
Previously been a councillor in North Lanarkshire, as you know, Cabinet Secretary. Would you agree with me that this whole system is run by councils and it's dependent on the council's adaptation of the system in order to provide that extra care to people? Because even prior to coming to this place, I had situations of people who were getting that time. And we also had situations in tower blocks in Motherwell where carers were jumping in, not jumping out of, but going into tower blocks and going into different blocks and people crossing over, which was totally crazy. And we tried to get the council to resolve it. But would you agree that it's entirely down to council?
Oh, it's a council-run function, but obviously with the integration agenda, and since I'm the Cabinet Secretary with responsibility for social care, I do want to ensure that people are getting the social care as well as the health care that they need. And that's why I've asked the Association of Social Work Directors to undertake this piece of work. And also it's something I think that we need to pay more attention to in the future, and we'll, once we see the outcome of the review of the national care standards, as well as decide the national outcomes to be achieved by the integrated adult health and social care partnerships, this is an area where we will need to be very clear that the standards will have to be met, and that's in relation to people's needs rather than dictated by other factors.
Thank you.
Doris?
Yeah, just very briefly on this matter of care visits, the amount of time. I was previously in correspondence with Glasgow City Council and Cordia in relation to how they report and quantify this. Now, I can't quite remember the specifics, but I do remember there was a lack of clarity in the reporting of it, and I make no judgment call of Glasgow City Council in relation to that, but in terms of how much time is spent inside a person's home, how much time is spent travelling to and from people's homes, and whether there is a double counting of actual care provided if you're including travelling time within within the reporting of that. And I'm not saying Glasgow's doing that, there was just a lack of clarity in how that was reported. Perhaps some consistency across the country in terms of how these stats are reported would be very, very helpful, because I don't think Glasgow was intending at all to obscure their data. I just don't think there's any consistency in how this is reported.
Well, the thing that matters to me as the Cabinet Secretary is not so much how much time people spend with each patient or with each end user, but actually what the outcomes are. Are they getting the service they require? Some services can be delivered in 15 minutes. Some services obviously take a lot longer. If you're making somebody's lunch, it's going to take a lot longer than 15 minutes. If you're getting some people out of bed in the morning, that's going to take, I suspect, a lot longer than 15 minutes. So I think, while I think it would be important as a way of performance monitoring and checking on things to keep a record of how much time is spent with the end users, the key issue is the outcomes of the service that they're getting. And that's absolutely key, because you cannot achieve the outcomes if you're not spending enough time with the end user.
Cabinet Secretary, I apologise. I think the lack of clarity was in my question there. The point I was trying to make was if a local authority, any local authority is reporting 10,000 hours care in the community in someone's home, irrespective of how many service users that is and how long for each individual visit, to make sure that travelling time is not included within that reporting. And to make sure how it's reported is done consistently across the country to allow national monitoring is the question.
Absolutely. I mean, no, I would still actually, if I was managing council's resources, I'd still want to know what the travelling time was, but that's for a management and resource and efficiency type reason, but I would want to know precisely how much time was spent with the end user. For other reasons, you should also monitor how much time is being spent travelling.
Rhoda Grant.
A question from Alan Kennedy. The Cabinet Secretary has now agreed that pharmacy applications are adversely affecting patients in rural areas and is carrying out a review of such legislation. Will the Cabinet Secretary direct that the review should include specific legislative change to encourage approval of applications where a community's patients support the co-located GP and pharmacy practices, and that such applications must not be overturned by objections from pharmacists operating out with the neighbourhood of the GP practices concerned?
Can I say I'm looking at two things as part of this review? One is the issue of pharmacies and the applications and the criteria for approving applications. As you know, there are major concerns at the moment around an application in Uist. And there's also concerns in rural Stirlingshire and indeed in some other parts of Scotland. And I don't think the current legislative framework is fit for purpose, and therefore we are reviewing that, and I hope to be able to go out to consultation very soon on that issue. In parallel, and as part of the same review, I'm looking at the actual process, having participated recently in a hearing for an application in my own constituency in my role as an MSP for a local pharmacy. It became very clear to me that the community has no voice in the current application process. I was there, I'll give you the example in my own community, in Airdrie, where the application under consideration had very active support from the community, had the support of the Labour MP, myself as the SNP MSP, had the support of every Labour councillor and every SNP councillor. We don't have Tory councillors in Airdrie. We don't have Liberal Democrat councillors in Airdrie. When we went to the hearing, the large pharmacy, the large chemists were there and spoke throughout the hearing. And I wasn't allowed to say a word, and I was the only person there representing the community. This is an absurd situation, and I intend to bring it to an end, and I intend to put in place a system sooner rather than later that takes much more account of what the community needs and wants, rather than allow large monopolies to dominate proceedings. And that's exactly what we're looking at, and I will be bringing forward proposals to Parliament on that.
I welcome that. I suppose one of my concerns is that at the moment there appears to be now a rush because people know the review is up and coming and things are going to change. There appears to be a rush of applications, certainly being discussed. Whether they all come forward is obviously something else. Is there a way of putting through some emergency legislation now, just to call a moratorium on new applications so that we can leave things as they are until the new regulations come through, and to allow them to be properly consulted on so that they are fit for purpose? Because, you know, you don't want to rush through new legislation and then maybe end up with unintended consequences, because it's quite a complex area.
Can I say, absolutely, and I've already said this in the Chamber, had I the power to have a moratorium on these applications and consideration of these applications, and we have explored every possible way for me to have the legal power to do that, I would have exercised that legal power and had a moratorium. I do not have the legal power to do so. Had I the legal power, I would definitely have imposed a moratorium until we review the rules. In terms of doing things quickly, we are going to do things quickly anyway, and it would, I don't think, make much sense to try to rush legislation through, which would still require orders to be laid, which would take, 40 days or whatever it takes for an order. I think we might as well concentrate on the job in hand and get it right. And I don't want to do it in such a way that I'm opened up to legal challenge on the matter either. I think it's beneficial, particularly for these communities who may be affected by these matters, for us to do the job properly, to do it according to process and to get it right, but I intend to do it quickly.
But could we not just legislate on that small matter of giving you the powers to call a moratorium and then do
the time it would take to do that, see, the regulations only require secondary legislation. The powers for a moratorium would require primary legislation, and it would take much longer to get that primary legislation than it would do to change the existing position through secondary legislation. So there's no great advantage in doing that.
Any other supplementary questions on that? I need to bring this session now to a close. The Cabinet Secretary has a Cabinet meeting to attend. We'll pass the questions to your department and complete them that way. But thank you very much for your attendance here this morning. I think it was an interesting exercise, and hopefully we can discuss how we can take this forward and improve the sessions. Thank you very much indeed.
Can I say also, Convener, the questions we didn't get to, I'm happy to send you the answers that I was going to give, and then you can allow them to be circulated to the committee and allow it to be placed in SPICE and made available to the people who took the trouble to submit the questions.
Yes. And I could say, we don't have any public participation, but it's been communicated to me. I must apologise for those who submitted questions who attended here in public today and didn't hear their question asked. The Cabinet Secretary notified the committee that he had to be away for 10:30 this morning. He stayed much longer than that, so I apologise. I think we've done well in getting through 12 questions and supplementaries, but we will review and discuss with the Cabinet Secretary's office and committee clerks how best we can improve and ensure there's enough time. But we will ensure a response to everyone through the Cabinet Secretary's cooperation. Thank you all very much. We now, as previously agreed, go into private session of the committee to discuss our reports. Thank you.